Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that the House suspend the rules and pass House Resolution 120.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 120, resolution recognizing the African American spiritual as a national treasure.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Davis, and the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. EHLERS, will each control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request 5 legislative days during which members may insert material relevant to House Resolution 120 into the record.
Without objection.
Unanimous consent, Mr. Speaker, to revise and extend.
Without objection.
Thank you. I yield myself as much time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize the African American spiritual as a national treasure. From 1619 to 1865, enslaved African Americans created their own unique form of expression known today as spirituals. As African Americans were not allowed to speak their native languages or play African musical instruments, spirituals were incorporated into the English language and the Christian religious faith. These spirituals were the strong African oral tradition of songs, stories, proverbs, and historical accounts. Spirituals have been a part of American culture from times of slavery to today, and their legacy is clear in today's gospel music. Spirituals were also sung during the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. Songs that we're familiar with, such as We Shall Overcome and Marching Round Selma, were heard in the South to unite African Americans in the struggle for civil rights. Some of the more commonly known songs, including Sweet Low, Sweet Chariot, and The Gospel Train, used language which described religious activities but had a second meaning relating to the Underground Railroad. Calvin Earl, a noted performer and educator of African American spirituals, stated that the lyrics used in spirituals became a metaphor for freedom from slavery, and they were a secret way for slaves to, quote, communicate with each other, teach their young, record their history, and heal their pain, unquote. Frederick Douglass, a fugitive slave who became one of the United States' leading abolitionists, stated that spirituals, and I quote, told a tale of woe which was altogether beyond feeble comprehension, and that every tone was a testimony against slavery and a prayer to God for deliverance from chains, unquote. This resolution is endorsed by the NAACP and the National Council of Negro Women, and I want to add my voice to theirs in support of helping to preserve a really treasured piece of American history. I urge my colleagues to resoundingly pass this resolution, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves the balance of her time. Gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of House Resolution 120, recognizing African American spirituals as a national treasure. Simply defined, spirituals are the songs created and first sung by African Americans during the times of slavery. These songs should be celebrated as a part of American culture today, for they are the source from which gospel, jazz, and blues evolved. The lyrics of these songs are tightly linked with the lives of their authors, and we're inspired by the message of Jesus Christ and the gospel of the Bible. The most pervasive message conveyed by spirituals is that of an enslaved people yearning to be set free. The slaves believed they understood better than anyone what freedom truly meant in both a spiritual and a physical sense, and I believe they were correct in believing that. The Old Testament scriptures that are referenced in their songs spoke of deliverance in this world, and they believed God would deliver them from bondage just as He had delivered the people of Israel. These spirituals are different from hymns and psalms because their creators used them as a way of sharing the hard condition of being a slave while also singing about their love and faith in God. They used the songs to teach their young, to record their history, and to heal their pain. These songs awakened possibilities in their lives and inspired so many to dream. Because the slaves were forbidden to learn how to read and write, they had to find ways to communicate secretly. The spirituals were a medium for several layers of communication and meaning. Throughout the 20th century, the spirituals experienced a renaissance as African Americans documented their struggles for equality. During the 1950s and 60s, before and during rallies for civil rights, demonstrators often sang spirituals such as "We Shall Overcome" and, believe it or not, "This Little Light of Mine," one of the favorite songs of my childhood. The lyrics of these new spirituals dealt with improvement and with a new kind of freedom. Many of them were inspired by social problems such as segregation, drug and alcohol abuse, and a basic lack of human equality. Today, the congregation of my church in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and so many other churches in our community and across the country continues to sing these spirituals. They inspire in us the human struggle for freedom and remind us of the lessons of history. I am honored to stand here today in support of House Resolution 120 to express the deepest gratitude and recognition to the former enslaved African Americans for their gifts to our nation, including their spiritual, music, and oral history. I ask my colleagues to support this resolution, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to recognize the gentlewoman from Connecticut, Ms. DeLAURO, for 5 minutes.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of legislation that would recognize the African American spiritual as a national treasure and would like to say thank you to my colleague from Georgia, Mr. Lewis, with whom I introduced this legislation in the Congress, as well as my colleagues on the floor this morning, the gentlelady from California and the gentleman from Michigan, and also Chairman Mr. Miller for bringing the bill to the floor. Mr. Speaker, even though they spring from one of the darkest periods of our nation's history, a period of turmoil that Americans still live with to this day, as we all know, African American spirituals have inspired many of America's most remarkable and enduring musical accomplishments. Name the modern music form, and it owes a debt to the spiritual. Jazz, blues, rock and roll, gospel, all trace their origins to this particular musical heritage. Today, people around the world play, listen to, and find the deepest of inspiration in the music of Africans who lived their lives in slavery. In so many ways, this is a uniquely American music, one born of our uniquely American experience, reminding us who we are, where we come from, and all that we are capable of as a society and as a nation. The African American spiritual is as poignant and powerful a genre of music as any in history. And throughout history, the African American spiritual has been kept alive through that oral tradition. For certain, this was so before the abolition of slavery in 1865, when these songs provided comfort and an outlet for spiritual yearning for so many. But also in the years immediately following abolition, when few wished to sing African American spirituals, so acute was the pain and anguish they called to mind. Thankfully, there were some who recognized then the power of these songs, the collective experiences from which they came, and their intrinsic cultural and musical value. And by the late 19th and early 20th century, the spiritual was kept alive by churches and singing groups like the Fisk Jubilee Singers, who traveled and performed these remarkable pieces in the face of hostility and intolerance. Indeed, in 1872, the Jubilee Singers sang at the World Peace Festival in Boston and were invited to perform at the White House that year by no less than President Grant himself. Today, African American spirituals are not only performed in churches and concert halls across the world, they are also studied by sociologists and musicologists across the country. The University of Denver's Spiritual Project puts it aptly in its mission statement. Spirituals uplift in times of crisis, heal, comfort, inspire, and instill hopes and dreams, thereby transforming individuals, communities, and whole societies. And in much the same spirit of the 5th Jubilee Singers, I want to say thank you to a good friend, a musicologist himself, for bringing to my attention the need for the Congress to honor this vital piece of our national heritage, Calvin Earl. As the youngest of 9 children in North Carolina, Calvin taught himself the guitar at age 7, forming his first rhythm and blues group while serving in the Army, before spending several decades performing jazz and big band music. Since 1989, Calvin has dedicated himself to preserving and sharing spirituals with a new generation of Americans. Traveling the country, he builds on the traditional words and melodies to illuminate the history and complexity of this unique art form. It was from Calvin that I learned about this remarkable tradition, how spirituals enabled slaves to teach their children, record their history, and surreptitiously communicate with one another. Indeed, songs such as Wade in the Water, The Gospel Train, and Swing Low, Sweet Chariot all reference the Underground Railroad. Another, Follow the Drinking Gourd, even contain a coded map to the Underground Railroad. As these songs were spontaneous, their authors are not known, though they were the inspiration for the writers of the first gospel songs, from Charles Albert Tindley to Harry Thacker Burley to John Rosamond Johnson. Mr. Speaker, no less than Frederick Douglass remarked that such spirituals, quote, told a tale of woe which was then altogether beyond my feeble comprehension. They were tones loud, long, and deep. They breathed the prayer and complaint of souls boiling over with a bitter anguish. Every tone was a testimony against slavery and a prayer to God for deliverance from chains. Indeed, in so many ways, the African American spiritual embodies who we are as Americans, the impact it has made on the cultural heritage of America, and indeed, every American is incalculable. I thank all who have allowed us to bring this resolution for consideration today. I urge my colleagues to support honoring this national treasure and this timeless reminder of the enduring human spirit.
Gentleman from Michigan.
I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentlewoman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Siris, for 2 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thanks.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 120, which recognizes the African American spiritual as a national treasure. Enslaved Africans who came to the European colonies were forbidden to speak their native languages, use African musical instruments, or practice their spiritual beliefs. To keep their African traditions alive through songs and stories, the slaves created a new kind of music. Today, these are known as spirituals. Mr. Calvin Earl, my constituent from Jersey City, has devoted his entire life to educating people about the history and the importance of African American spirituals. He started a program called The Gifts from My Ancestors. Through songs, dances, and storytelling, this program has helped people experience the story of enslaved African Americans. Mr. Speaker, I commend Mr. Earl for his work, and I believe it is time to recognize the importance of these spirituals, preserve them for future generations by voting in favor of H.R. 120. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Michigan.
I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentlewoman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, for 2 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the gentlewoman from California for yielding. I rise in strong support of HRES 120, recognizing the African American spiritual as a national treasure. Growing up in the rural South in the 1950s, we grew up on what was then called the Negro spiritual. And many of these songs, of course, had great meaning, especially the lyrics. I remember, for the old man that's coming to carry me to freedom, if you follow the drinking gourd. Well, gourds supposedly grew northward. And if you followed the direction of the gourd, you would get out of the slave South back during slavery and the abolitionist period, and you'd be headed north. And so not only did these songs sound good, not only were they spiritually uplifting, as one that I heard on this past Sunday at the Second Baptist Church in Maywood, Illinois, but they also were didactic. They were teaching and inspirational. So I commend the gentlewoman from Connecticut for her introduction of this great resolution, urge its support, and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Michigan.
Reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cooper, for 2 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentlelady for California for yielding. I would like to lend my voice in praise of the African American spiritual and the group that I consider to be the leading practitioners of it today and for the last 135 years, namely the Fisk Jubilee Singers. As the representative from Nashville, Tennessee, I have the honor of representing Fisk University, which, under the able leadership of President Hazel O'Leary, is achieving new heights in excellence. But the Fisk Jubilee Singers have been there since 1871, singing some of the most beautiful music in the world, and a music that's laden with a God-given message. No other music that I'm familiar with covers the range from agony to inspiration, from the depths of human misery and despair, all the way up to religious bliss. This is remarkable music, and I would suggest to you, if you haven't heard the Fisk Jubilee Singers sing it, under the able direction of Dr. Paul Kwame, you have not fully lived. This is a truly remarkable group and a remarkable inspirational message. So let's praise today the anonymous African-American genius that's allowed these songs to flourish and survive some of the toughest conditions on our planet. And let's honor groups like the Fisk Jubilee Singers that keep that tradition alive and fresh for each new generation. Yes, Mr. Speaker, this is truly a national treasure. We need to honor and preserve it and spread its wonderful message all around the world. The African American spiritual is part of God's great heritage. Thank you.
Gentleman from Michigan.
Reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentlewoman from California.
Thank you. We have no further speakers, and does the gentleman yield back?
Gentleman from Michigan.
Yes, I yield myself such time as I may consume. It always amazes me how the Lord manages to turn evil to good. And this is a good example of that, how out of the terrible abuse and sin of slavery came the beautiful spirituals that we are honoring in this particular resolution. It is a real national treasure. It is something that I grew up with. I recall my family, we had a number of musicians in the family. Very frequently we're singing the Negro spirituals. In groups at church we would sing Negro spirituals. And yet, look where they came from. Out of the terrible black mark in the history of this country, when we had slavery over half the nation. And yet, the human response, guided by God, came out of these people and produced this beautiful, beautiful music. It's a heritage we all have. It's a heritage we must enjoy, and above all, a heritage that we must honor, as we are honoring in this resolution today. With that, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. The gentlewoman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to close on House Resolution 120. And I want to thank my colleagues for their eloquence in speaking to this resolution. Truly, the African American spiritual is a national treasure. It must be embraced as such, enjoyed, and enhanced, always in our thoughts and in our history, because it has played such a critical part to so many thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And so I thank everyone for being here today and for presenting that to us. And I will close now, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Does the gentlewoman yield back her time?
Yes.
All time has expired. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 120? Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed? In the opinion of the Chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended.
Mr. Speaker, on that I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on the question are postponed.
HR 434.